Only 180 kilometers separate the island of Taiwan, geographically, from China. But politically, economically, and culturally, the two countries are worlds apart. Despite decades of dictatorship, Taiwan is now considered one of the most democratic countries in the world, and is even ahead of Germany in the Democracy Index. China, on the other hand, is considered authoritarian to totalitarian and continues to expand its cruel surveillance state. Economically, Taiwan is probably the most important region in the world, which is mainly due to the fact that 90% of all semiconductors, which are essential for every electronic device, are produced there. The GDP per capita of the Taiwanese is also 3 times higher than that of the Chinese. Finally, we also see a cultural difference of night and day. While an open-minded, liberal, and pluralistic society has emerged in Taiwan, China continues to shield its citizens through censorship. But how could two originally very similar regions develop in such completely different ways? Why is this a thorn in the side of the Chinese government? And what secret trump card does Taiwan have up its sleeve in the event of war? We take a look at all these exciting questions in today's video. Have fun! To understand the history of the small island, we first have to jump back to the time of the discoveries. Because of its strategic location, it quickly became the plaything of the great powers, first the Europeans and later the Asian superpowers. The first to do so were Portuguese sailors, who secured the island in the 16th century and named it Ilha Formosa, the beautiful island. Until then, however, the island was not uninhabited, but was home to various indigenous peoples who had their own rich culture and language. The first permanent colony was then established by the Dutch in 1624 in the south of Formosa, Fort Zeelandia, named after the Dutch region of Zeeland, just like New Zealand. However, this did not go unnoticed by the other Europeans, and just 2 years later, the Spanish also established a colony in the northern part of the island. There were now constant tensions and conflicts between the Dutch and the Spanish for supremacy in Formosa. However, the Dutch were clearly superior due to their strong navy and greater numbers of troops, and they managed to drive the Spanish completely off the island just 2 decades later. The Dutch then consolidated their control over Taiwan and used it as a central trading base for trade with East Asia, particularly with China and Japan. Both states were very cut off and isolated at this time, as they feared the influence of the Europeans. Taiwan was therefore ideal for the Dutch to establish a stable trading network on the east coast of Asia. But times were soon to change, as the Dutch presence was short-lived. In the middle of the 17th century, a major civil war broke out in Greater China between the Qing and the Ming dynasty, which had ruled until then, with the latter using Taiwan as a retreat. Pay close attention here, because the scenario was to be repeated later. The latter Ming dynasty had ruled China for several centuries, but was now gradually ousted by the Qing dynasty. It therefore retreated to Taiwan and completely drove out the Dutch after several battles. The Dutch ruled Taiwan for a few more decades until they were defeated by the new Qing dynasty at the end of the 17th century, and Taiwan was incorporated into China. A scenario that would probably not be far from the mind of the current Chinese president. Taiwan now became an integral part of the Chinese empire, with the government encouraging massive immigration from mainland China. This led to rapid population growth and completely changed the demographics of the island. The Chinese built the large cities on the west coast, while the original inhabitants of the island were driven further and further into the eastern mountainous regions. Their population steadily dwindled. This process continued for almost 2 centuries, with uprisings by the local population being brutally suppressed. However, at the end of the 19th century, the rise of a new Asian superpower began, which was only too happy to take advantage of the conflicts on the island: the Japanese Empire. They not only defeated the Russians in a spectacular war, but also the Chinese a short time later. This gave them supremacy in East Asia, and they also incorporated Taiwan into their growing empire as a colony. The Japanese introduced a strict colonial administration and began extensive modernization measures. The Japanese language and culture were promoted, which led to partial assimilation and distanced the Taiwanese further from China. However, Japanese rule did not last too long. During the Second World War, Japan used Taiwan as an important military base and supply depot for its operations in Southeast Asia. Allied air raids on Taiwan began in 1944, causing severe damage to infrastructure and cities. And with Japan's surrender in August 1945, its rule over Taiwan came to an end. But who was to succeed it? We have to look to China, where a bloody civil war between two camps had been raging for decades. On the one hand, there was the Kuomintang, which had ruled until then under its leader Chiang Kai-shek. On the other side was the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong. The former wanted to further develop a unified nationalist government on the Chinese mainland, while the latter was striving for a communist revolution. And Mao Zedong increasingly gained the upper hand, which is why the nationalists withdrew to Taiwan with the support of the Americans. They established Taipei as their new capital. And so the Chinese Civil War ended in 1949. As a result, the Communist Party controlled the mainland, while the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek consolidated their rule over Taiwan. They established a strict military dictatorship on the island and prepared for a possible reconquest of the mainland. On the other hand, the Communist Party made it its top priority to reintegrate Taiwan, as it had done a few centuries earlier after the Civil War, a demand that still exists today. Until then, the two political systems had acted relatively similarly. Both Taiwan and China were ruled with an iron hand. Thousands of political opponents were imprisoned, tortured, or executed, and there were no civil liberties. But from the 1970s onwards, Taiwan suddenly developed in a completely different direction. Taiwan was one of the first East Asian states to experience rapid economic growth. This was because the government began to liberalize the economy early on, following the American model, invested heavily in the education system, and quickly jumped on key technologies. Alongside Singapore, South Korea, and Hong Kong, Taiwan is therefore regarded as one of the tiger economies, i.e., emerging Asian countries that caught up with the industrialized nations within a few decades. For the first time, great prosperity and a broad middle class emerged, and the well-educated citizens and social mobility ultimately promoted political awareness and the desire for more political participation among the population. Opposition movements emerged from the mid-1970s, and it was precisely in 1975 that Chiang Kai-shek, who had ruled until then, died. His son was already seen as much more liberal and gradually established political reforms. The Democratic Progressive Party was founded in 1986 as the first legal opposition party, and from then on, the first free elections were held. To this day, a pluralistic democracy has emerged, which has led to great prosperity on the island thanks to sustained economic growth. The result was an open and free society based on the Western model, quite the opposite of China. There, too, there was later an economic opening and a rapid economic rise, but without any political or social changes. And so Taiwan is also the Communist Party's greatest fear, because it shows a Chinese population living in freedom and democracy, a system that could also be a model for mainland China. But the Communist Party is doing everything it can to prevent this. This ranges from internet censorship of its own population, to election manipulation in Taiwan, to the ultimate solution: the conquest of the islands and reorganization according to the communist model. Since Xi Jinping came to power, there have been repeated threats of so-called reunification, and many experts no longer consider a war between the two sides to be out of the question. However, Taiwan still has a few aces up its sleeve. On the one hand, there is its close partnership with the USA, the West, and other Asian powers. On the other hand, its own military armament and preparations for such a scenario have been in place for decades, and its economy in particular makes it an elementary piece of the global geopolitical puzzle. The early focus on key technologies such as semiconductors has paid off handsomely. Today, the country produces more than 60% of all semiconductors worldwide, and more than 90% of the most advanced semiconductors. The whole world is therefore completely dependent on the small island. As a result, it is hoping for massive support in the event of a war. Without semiconductors, global supply chains would probably collapse, and, moreover, no one in the West would like to have this key technology in the hands of the Communist Party.
Mit Indien im Himalaya-Gebirge empfehlen. Ich verlinke es euch direkt hier. Viel Spaß beim Anschauen und ich sage ciao.